Carla Gonzalez, and this is APB News. Tonight we have received very sad news. Just this morning, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Tonight's news broadcast will be a special edition, commemorating important leaders like him and other important events of the Civil Rights Movement. We begin with Kayla in Washington, D.C.
Hey everyone, we are here in Washington, D.C. on this tragic April 4th, 1968. Today, we have received news of the tragic death of Martin Luther King Jr. The person responsible for this assassination is James Earl Ray, who aimed a rifle at the hotel balcony Dr. King was standing on. Dr. King had just given a speech in Memphis the previous day and seems to have foreshadowed his death, but he claimed that he may not make it to the day when Promised Land would arrive. I'm currently out here on the streets of Washington, D.C. to get a sense of what the people think on Dr. King's death. Here's our first person.
Dr. King was actively seeking a path to the Promised Land that each and every one of us deserves and has a right to. No matter what, we will continue his legacy, not only to honor him, but to achieve equality for all inside and outside of the home.
In 1954, after the case of Brown versus Board of Education, the movement to chip away Jim Crow laws gained momentum. Let's take a look at a report from 1954 with Christine Lee.
This case began when the Browns argued that Lindis Brown's rights were violated after being denied admission into a nearby elementary school. This case was closed today with the Supreme Court ruling that segregation in schools was unconstitutional.
With Marshall's recent win, there are state officials who expect segregation to end with little trouble. However, some of the Congress members are claiming the right of states to ignore the ruling.
It was also in 1955 when the Montgomery bus boycott began. The issue began when African-American seamstress Rosa Parks was arrested after refusing to give up her seat. Let's take a look with Deanson in Montgomery.
I am reporting here live from the Montgomery studio. African Americans all around Montgomery are boycotting public buses. The citizens are now relying on a carpool system. Today I have an exclusive interview with Joanne Gibson Robinson, one of the instigators of this ongoing boycott. Let's hear her thoughts. Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you here on APV News this morning.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Now, from my understanding, segregated buses were instituted in 1883. What are your goals for this boycott?
Desegregation on buses has been a long-time goal. In hearing what happened to Rosa Parks, myself, and others, we were outraged. It was humiliating. I hope that our actions can help advocate for a safe, positive, and equal society for all people, no matter what race.
Have you personally had any bad experiences on segregated public buses?
Yes, I have, and it was one of my motivations for instigating this boycott. I once sat down in the front. The bus driver immediately raised his voice and hand at me.
I'm sorry you had to experience that. Now, I'm aware that the victory in the Brown versus Board of Education case last year was also a big milestone for segregation, but there are still many resistances from the public, correct?
That is correct. I have heard citizens boycotting businesses that are supporting desegregation, and in some areas, the Ku Klux Klan reappeared.
Thank you for your valuable time and insight. Now back to you, Carla.
Next up was a crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas from September 1957. This national sensation began when Governor Orval Faubus ordered the National Guard to deny 9 African-American students from admitting into Little Rock's Central High School.
I'm reporting live from Little Rock, Arkansas. 2 days ago, 9 African-American students volunteered to integrate Little Rock's Central High School to set the scene for desegregation. These students were rejected and harassed. A 15-year-old student, Elizabeth Eckford, even faced an abusive crowd. This morning, President Eisenhower was forced to act, and he ordered 1,000 paratroopers into Little Rock. The soldiers escorted the 9 students to their classes. Still, there were reports of bullying and harassment.
Now, let's head over to Christine Lee reporting the racial tensions happening in the South.
Many members of the African American community are outraged after the arrest of Rosa Parks, forming the Montgomery Improvement Association with Martin Luther King Jr. as a leader. Plans for the boycotts are gaining momentum. As we begin to discuss the racial violence in this period, I will have to warn you that some of the scenes are disturbing. Our television crew has brought coverage of many of the sit-ins in which African American protesters sit down at segregated lunch counters and refuse to leave until they were served. Day after day, our reporters captured some of the many scenes of whites beating and pouring food over students. There is no denying the ugly face of discrimination. However, many black students are continuing to refuse to back down, despite arrests and beatings.
Thanks to men like Martin Luther King Jr., Others took a stand to end the division of the nation's people, segregation. Let's take a look back at some of the actions of these brave young men from a bus riot in 1961. We have Laura Whitmarsh on the story.
James Peck, a civil rights activist, has recently joined forces with other core members on a memorable bus trip across the South, testing the Supreme Court's decision to ban segregated seating. Violence began after white racists assaulted the African Americans on Bus 1 and announced their arrival with a harsh riot. Bus 2 was also attacked by another group of angry whites, resulting in a firebomb being tossed onto the moving vehicle. Luckily, no casualties were found as the freedom fighters managed to escape before the explosion. Later, the riders were refused any more transport by 3 different bus companies out of fear for their lives. The ride ended in more harassment by white racists. Finally, President Kennedy awarded the freedom fighters with direct support and the ban of segregation in all interstate travel facilities, including waiting rooms, restrooms, and lunch counters.
Hey guys, here with your weather forecast. So the next week, it seems to be a cloudy week with the highs being in the low 50s and the lows being in the low 40s. However, you can also expect to see some chance of rain. Back to the studio.
Those who weren't afraid to speak up about the constant racial discrimination proved very successful. We have received results involving a rise in the amount of African Americans who are registered to vote. Laura, fill us in.
It is the year 1968, and the number of African Americans registering to vote has risen 60% since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The act eliminated voter literacy tests and enabled federal examiners to register voters. The year before that, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned most discrimination in employment and public accommodations.
Another prominent figure of the civil rights movement was Malcolm X. He was also shot about 3 years ago, and he also deserves to be remembered. Let's take a look with Cassidy Trong in New York.
The common conflicts African Americans faced was de facto segregation back in the 1960s, and many leading figures took control in the civil rights movement. I'm here in New York reporting live, remembering the encounter between the white police and African Americans. De facto segregation continues to intensify as it was harder to fight off, and many African Americans continue to migrate to northern cities. It led to whites moving to suburbs, African Americans living in decay, and schools deteriorated through time. Many blacks were angered at the brutal treatment. A dangerous encounter between the white police and African Americans sparked a riot in central Harlem. 34 people were killed and millions of properties were destroyed. Leader Malcolm X declared his power to the Harlem audience. He was jailed but learned the teachings of Elijah Muhammad in prison, which he was able to appeal an audience where he advocated Elijah's teachings. It was known as the Nation of Islam. He was a powerful figure and important to the civil rights movement.
That concludes our reflection of the ongoing civil rights movement. Now let's return to Kayla for the most recent breaking news.
Although we have experienced the devastating death of Martin Luther King Jr., there seems to be plans of a new Civil Rights Act of 1968. Not only would this act end discrimination in regards to housing, but it would also provide better jobs and business opportunities for African Americans. Affirmative action programs would be implemented to employ minority groups who have experienced discrimination. In addition, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 will work to end educational inequality, poverty, and racism altogether. Well, folks, it seems as though we will reach the promised land once and for all.
Thank you for watching tonight's special edition of APB News.
Enjoy the rest of the AP World period. Next up was the crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas, from September 1957.
Resistance is from the public, correct? That is correct. I have heard citizens going to the floor.
Your weather forecast. So tomorrow seems to be high 60s and the I can't.
Dr. King was acting.
Thank you for watching this special edition.